Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about the important budget debate that we'll have this week here in the United States Senate. And we hope to get on that soon. We're disposing of some of last year's budget work before that, but I think this is really kind of an important moment for the United States Senate because it's been 4 years since we did this. 2009 was the last time that the United States Senate acted on a budget. And during the time in which the time that's lapsed, we've added $6 trillion to our national debt. So I would like to think that as we get into this budget debate, we could do something about that. Unfortunately, the budget that's going to be put before us by the Senate Democrats doesn't do anything to address the debt. And I think the reason perhaps that we are finally doing a budget here is because there was a No Budget, No Pay Act passed earlier this year, which required that a budget be passed. It was moved by the House of Representatives, at least, and it drew attention to the fact that the Senate hadn't for 4 years done a budget and suggested that perhaps before the Senate should actually get paid, it actually ought to do its work. It actually ought to pass a budget. And so we are here now for the first time in 4 years. And unfortunately, the budget that's been proposed by the chair of the Senate Budget Committee fails to balance the budget and instead means more taxes, more spending, and more debt. And that's a formula that we've heard before, actually. In fact, if you look at the last several years, we've added, as I said earlier, $6 trillion to the debt since President Obama took office. We've seen tax increases already to the tune of about $1.7 trillion if you combine the tax increases associated January 1st with the fiscal cliff, and then couple that with the tax increases that were included in the President's health care bill. $1.7 trillion in new taxes, $6 trillion in new debt, a run-up in spending unlike anything we've seen in recent history. So you would think that given the fact that we've seen debt, spending, and taxes go up over the past several years, that we would actually get a budget that is finally focused not on growing the government, but on growing the economy. But the Senate Democrat budget does exactly that. It grows the government, not the economy. Their proposal contains more of the same big spending and big government policies that have led to a dismal average economic growth rate of just 0.8% over the past 4 years. That's been the economic growth, Mr. President, on average for the past 4 years, the first 4 years of President Obama's his first term. 0.8%. Less than 1% is what the economy has grown over that time period. Now, a better approach when it comes to putting forward a budget would be to advance a budget that actually is focused on growing the economy, not the government. Over the next few days, we're going to have an opportunity to debate and improve this budget proposal on the Senate floor. And I look forward to that debate. As it stands today, the Senate Democrat budget increases spending by 62% over the next decade. It raises taxes by $1.5 trillion, and that's in addition, as I said earlier, to the $1.7 trillion in tax increases that we've already seen enacted under President Obama. Even with the enormous tax increase, the Senate Democrat budget would result in $7.3 trillion in new debt over the next decade. So you've got a 62% increase in spending. You have $1.5 trillion in new taxes, and a $7.3 trillion debt, addition to the debt that we hand down to our children and grandchildren. The amazing thing about that, Mr. President, even with this enormous tax increase, the budget would never balance, which begs the question, what is balanced about a budget that never balances? You know, we always hear the Democrats come here on the floor of the United States Senate and talk about we need a balanced approach. We hear the President of the United States get up all the time and talk about we need a balanced approach. Well, what's balanced about a budget that never balances? I think the American people, that's a fundamental question I would expect them to ask. In contrast to the Senate Democrat budget, the House Republicans have enacted a budget, or will be enacting a budget this week, getting it through. It's not going to be enacted, it's going to get through the House of Representatives. Hopefully, eventually, something like it will get enacted. But it balances in 10 years. I think 10 years is a responsible, reasonable timeline to achieve a balanced budget. And I think most Americans who balance their budgets month in and month out would agree with that proposition. The budget put forward by Senate Democrats also fails to target waste, fraud, and inefficiencies across the federal government. For each of the past 2 years, the Government Accountability Office has outlined hundreds of billions of dollars of wasteful and duplicative spending throughout the federal government. The federal government is a $3.6 trillion enterprise, and there is plenty of ways to target and reform. Low-hanging fruit, I think most of us would agree, is a complete waste of taxpayer dollars. But Senate Democrats have failed to even make an attempt at reining in this waste with their budget plan. Mr. President, budgets are a reflection of values. As Vice President Biden once said, and I quote, "Show me your budget, and I will tell you what you value," end quote. It seems from the Senate Democrats' budget that they value the same big spending, big government policies of the past 4 years that have prolonged this period of slow economic growth and high unemployment. In contrast, the budget proposed by the Republicans in the House would balance the budget in 10 years. Again, something I believe we ought to be able to do. And it grows the economy. It starts by cutting wasteful spending, which is not an extreme proposition, and it's something that we ought to be able to do. The House Republican budget also reforms our broken tax code to promote economic growth, which will mean more jobs, better pay, and more opportunities for hardworking Americans and middle-class families. The House budget also recognizes that if Washington fails to take action, Medicare and Social Security are headed toward bankruptcy in the not-too-distant future. I commend my colleagues in the House for the vote that they will have this week and for recognizing that reality, that our seniors across this country and those who are nearing retirement age and those younger generations of Americans are not going to be protected when it comes to the programs that someday they will rely upon if we don't make the changes and the reforms that are necessary to align those programs with the present and current and future demographics of this country. And so the House budget strengthens those priorities. The budget debate for fiscal year 2014 that we're going to have on the Senate floor this week presents an opportunity to solve our fiscal challenges, to move past the job-destroying policies of the past few years, and to grow the economy. As I said earlier, average economic growth under this president has been 0.8%, 0.8% of the overall share of the economy. It's a reflection of the negative impacts that high levels of spending and high annual deficits have had during President Obama's tenure. Unfortunately, the proposal that will be before the Senate this week only doubles down, if you will, on those policies. In fact, there's evidence that this is the opposite of what we should be doing. Harvard professors Alberto Alcina and Sylvia Ardagna, excuse me if I pronounce those names wrong, have studied economies around the world and various fiscal adjustments that have taken place in some of these countries. They found that targeted spending cuts have led to economic expansions, while tax increases have been recessionary. According to these Harvard economists, and I quote, "Spending cuts have a positive effect on private investment, while increases to taxes hurt investment through the labor market in firms' profitability," end quote. Mr. President, the evidence is there. Growing the government will not solve our economic challenges. If that were true, we would have a much stronger economy today, because with the massive health care plan that passed a few years ago, with the stimulus program, trillion-dollar stimulus program that was put into place early on during the President's first term, and all the additional run-up in discretionary spending that we've seen, we still have slow growth, high unemployment, massive amounts of debt, and many Americans who are struggling with their own personal economies, lower take-home pay. The focus should be on growing our economy, and that starts with passing a budget that cuts spending and reforms the tax code in a way that promotes economic growth. Again, I believe that there is a better approach out there, Mr. President. The House of Representatives have put forth one. It's really unfortunate that the Senate Democrat budget fails to address the long-term spending and economic problems facing this country, and instead focuses once again on growing government. In fact, the Washington Post, the editorial board, had this to say of the Democrats' budget proposal, and I quote, "In short, This document gives voters no reason to believe that Democrats have a viable plan or even a responsible public assessment of the country's long-term fiscal predicament." End quote. Mr. President, failure to act and solve our fiscal challenges could result in another damaging credit downgrade thanks to the out-of-control spending, and such a downgrade would have a very negative effect on the American people. The credit downgrade would drive up interest rates across the board on everything from student loans to home mortgages. That means it would be more expensive to buy a home or a car, to send a child to college, or to pay down personal debt. And so as we get ready to debate the majority's proposed budget for fiscal year 2014 on the floor this week, I hope that the Senate will take an honest look at the relationship between spending and economic growth. We need to put the federal government on a stable fiscal path in order to create the kind of economic certainty and the economic conditions that we need to grow our economy and to create jobs. Mr. President, the majority's budget goes in the opposite direction. It grows government instead of growing the economy. We need to be talking about a budget here in the United States Senate whose primary focus is to grow the economy, not to grow the government. And so this will give us a chance over the course of the next few days to present two very different visions for the future of this country. One that's based upon higher spending, higher taxes, more debt, and one that's focused on putting in place a responsible spending plan that protects and saves important programs like Social Security and Medicare, that reforms our tax code in a way that encourages and promotes economic growth, and that puts policies in place, Mr. President, that will actually get this economy growing and expanding again, get more Americans back to work, and increase the standard of living and the quality of life for future generations of Americans. We can't do that if we continue to borrow and spend like there's no tomorrow, and that is precisely what the Democrat budget would do. Mr. President, I yield the floor.